today what we're going to do is we're not going over content yet. We're not going to start with Unit 3 yet. What we're going to do is just do a recap again about like really trying to help you frame writing a 2B. So I'm going to present a question, and we're really going to go over what you really need to think about to make sure you actually answer the question to the demands of the question. So the question we're going to look at is, space there, sorry. All right, so the question is, how far had the position of ex-slaves improved by 1877? So some things I want to point out to you, or you help point out as well. What are some of the key words here that we really need to look at? Improved. What else?
How far?
Those are the big things. So, we're looking at this. Question is, how far had the position of ex-slaves improved by 1877? So let's look at two ways to frame this. Let's just put all of our information together first, before we start looking at degrees of improvement. All right, so let's see what are some ways that it did not improve. So
they still acted kind of like slaves.
Okay. Sharecropping, tenant farming, all those types of farming. What else?
Voting rights system.
Give me some specifics of how.
Racial groups, more
Like
Not for voting rights. Hold that thought. Not the grandfather clause. Grandfather clause helped white people. But you're on the right track there. What did the grandfather clause exempt people from?
voting.
The tax.
Poll tax. And okay. You said it. That's why you pulled that thought. Black codes. What else hurt the position of ex-slaves?
The Democrats regaining power.
So what were they called?
Oh, the Redeemers.
The Redeemers. What else? That was disbanded. Which one I'm surprised you guys haven't said yet. Okay, so we've talked about a little bit about social position, so keeping on that thought, what other type of position looked like it improved but didn't improve by the end? You have your social life and your political. They had it, and they lost it. By 1877, they had lost it. So that all goes in, and then I would also throw in, which you guys,
Oh no, definitely not.
KKK, they didn't do anything to the social position or the political position of former slaves. All right, so yes, it did improve. Give me some ways that it did improve. Besides just the fact that they weren't slaves anymore.
I was about to say you're not slaves.
They did get some education. They gained land.
Jobs.
They were getting what?
Land.
Land. Little. Citizenship. That's a big one. That was a really big one. Temporarily, what did they have? Voting rights. Temporarily, what were some of them able to do? Well, they all worked. Work in the government. At first, sharecropping worked out for them. Some of the things are written on both sides, aren't they? Yes. So, when you think about that, and you look back up here, how far had the position of ex-slaves improved? By 1877. So here, how do you think you would frame this one? Like, if you're looking at it like their improvement.
Not really.
I would start off like long term. They did not increase short term.
That's how I would frame it too. Initially, their situation improved quite a bit. Initially, their condition improved quite a bit. They were freed. The Freedmen's Bureau was enacted. So the Freedmen's Bureau was able to help build education, help educate them, help establish universities like Howard University, which I believe is where our Vice President-elect went to school at. Oh, correct. She went to an HBCU. So you have the education improvement. You have citizenship that comes about with the 14th Amendment. So granting them their citizenship rights, which in effect temporarily eliminate black codes. They're given the right to vote. So that's a whole lot different, right? That's a massive improvement. Plus they have positions in the government. Some are even U.S. senators. And initially sharecropping gives them the capability of owning land and farming their own crops. However, that improvement, I would say, was very limited. Would be, so I've already established how far there by saying it's limited improvement. However, long term, the only real big improvement was they weren't slaves anymore. So you could throw that in. Overall, they're not slaves anymore because at the end of the day, they are. Some of them are essentially slaves again because of the amount of debt that they took on. They couldn't leave the farms they worked on. Sharecropping ended up hurting them financially long term and tying them to the land just as much as they were tied during slavery. Their voting rights were systematically eliminated because the Supreme Court said it was completely within the rights of the states to determine how voting worked. So that meant that when states put in poll taxes and literacy tests, it was completely constitutional. And states were able to use that to eliminate the voting rights that had been gained. So by 1877, ex-slaves weren't voting anymore. Additionally, black codes, which were initially set up, which were eliminated by the 14th Amendment, were able to essentially creep back in and became a precursor for, you know the name of it? What was the situation we had starting pretty much in 1877 forward? These are an S.
Segregation.
Segregation. It's the
Oh.
precursor for segregation. Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws replaced these. And that gets started around the time of 1877. The Redeemers take over Southern governments with the exception of, before 1877, with the exception of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. But by 1877, they do take it over through the 1876 election. So there's Redeemer governments, which are very much going to be anti-free slave, are going to be working against them. The Freedmen's Bureau gets disbanded, and their role in the government is completely eliminated. In some states, it still hasn't come back up. So, you have all this information. You can say, yes, it improved. Look at all these improvements. However, you can torpedo all of them by 1877. So this is what I want you to make sure that you focus on the wording of the question. Did the position of ex-slaves improve by 1877? Yes, it did.
But no, it didn't.
But how far?
No.
Very limited improvement. So you would say, because at the end of the day, were they improved from 1865?
Yes.
Yeah. But you're also looking at it going, the improvement is they're not slaves anymore. So that's not much of an improvement. So you have to look at that how far. And here I would use the phrase, there was limited improvement. Here is your evidence for improvement. Here is your evidence of why it was limited. And why in some cases they were back at square one. So you see how you could do that. Because now your instinct was ready to go, not improved. Yes, it wasn't improved, but there was limited improvement. Because simply not being a slave anymore was, in one sense, an improvement. You can't have rights taken away from you if you never had them to begin with. You know what I mean? So you see how you could go about answering this as an ACE question? And a thoroughly well-developed and well-argued question that meets the demands of the question.
So the did would be the first paragraph and the not would be kind of.
That's how I would word it. Because you can argue it did improve. Like, I mean, there's obviously more evidence for it did not because it dismantles it. So you would, but I still think you would say there was a very limited improvement. So you're saying, here's how it improved, but then this is how that was all stripped away. So it did improve, but it was almost it was almost a wash. Because I don't necessarily think you can, I mean, you could almost argue that it worsened. But remember, this isn't actually asking that. It's asking did it improve. But I would say, so you're arguing here, could you argue that it worsened though? Yeah, there are some arguments for it worsening, like them being a thing. But by 1877, were they much of a thing anymore? No. They've been pretty much eliminated. So you can also, that's how I would suggest writing this. Limited improvement. But feel free to argue whatever case you feel you have the best support for, that you can argue the best. Remember that with these ACE questions for 2B. There are correct ways to respond to the question and correct evidence to use for the question. However, as long as, always pick the side that you have the best evidence for and that you have the easier time arguing. Because ACE isn't going to dock you if you take the one side or the other. You can take either side. All they're looking for is, do you have the history? Is it accurately implemented? And did you follow the demands of the question? Not whether or not they actually agree with the overall stance you took. Capiche? All right, knock it out.
And 2B, there's